If you walked into a high-end nightclub in Atlanta in the early 2000s, a place like the Velvet Room or Club Chaos, you might have witnessed a scene that defied every rule of the criminal underworld. Usually, if you are the head of a massive multi-state cocaine empire, you want to be invisible. You want to be a ghost. You don't want people to know your name, let alone your face. The doors would swing open and the Black Mafia family would arrive. They didn't sneak in, they rolled deep. They arrived in a convoy of luxury SUVs that shut down traffic on Peachtree Street. They wore matching jackets embroidered with BMF, the world is BMF's. And at the center of it all was Demetrius, Big Meech Flannery. He wasn't hiding. He was standing on the bar, throwing literal bricks of cash in the air. Tens of thousands of dollars raining down like confetti on the crowd. They rented billboards on the highway that said, "The world is BMF's." They parked tour buses painted with their logo in front of the police station. It was the most brazen, audacious, and frankly insane display of criminal power in American history. They were taunting the DEA. They were daring the FBI to stop them. But beneath the champagne and the hip-hop glamour, there was a machine, a lethal industrial-grade logistics machine that makes Amazon look disorganized. We are talking about an organization that started with two brothers selling $50 bags of crack in high school and grew into a $250 million enterprise with hubs in 11 states. They had a direct pipeline to the Mexican cartels. They had a fleet of limousines modified with James Bond-style trapdoors. They had a legitimate record label that served as the world's flashiest washing machine for dirty money. This is the story of the Black Mafia Family. It is a story of brotherhood, betrayal, and the seduction of the American dream in the rawest, most uncut form. It is the story of how two kids from Detroit tried to buy the music industry with cocaine money and how they almost got away with it. To understand the scale of BMF, you have to go back to the rust and concrete of Detroit in the mid-1980s. This was the crack era. The factories were closing, the economy was cratering, and the streets were flooded with cheap cocaine. In southwest Detroit, two brothers, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery and Terry Southwest T. Flannery, saw an opening. They were ostensibly in high school, but their real education was on the street corner. They started small. They formed a crew called the 50 Boys. The name wasn't a gang sign, it was a price point. They sold $50 bags of crack cocaine. But even then, they were different. Most drug dealers were chaotic. They fought over corners. They spent their profit on flashy clothes immediately. The Flannery brothers were disciplined. They realized early on that violence is bad for business. If you shoot up a block, the police come and the customers leave. So they focused on customer service and product consistency. By the late 80s, the 50 Boys had outgrown the street corner. They weren't just selling bags anymore. They were moving kilos. But Detroit was a crowded market. You had established gangs, you had remnants of the old heroin rings. It was a shark tank. The Flannery brothers realized that to truly scale up, they needed to get closer to the source. They needed to cut out the middlemen. This is the pivotal moment where most dealers fail, but where BMF was born. They established a direct connection with the Mexican cartels. This was unheard of for a crew from Detroit. Usually the Mexicans only dealt with major wholesalers in border states. But Meech and Terry had charm. They had cash, and they had a reputation for reliability. By the early 90s, they were bringing pure, uncut cocaine directly from the source into the Midwest. They were no longer street dealers. They were wholesalers. They were the supply chain. As the money started pouring in, we're talking millions of dollars a month, the brothers made a strategic decision that would define their empire. They realized that Detroit was too small, too hot, and too dangerous. They needed to diversify geographically. This led to the Great Split. Demetrius Big Meech moved to Atlanta. Terry Southwest T moved to LA. This wasn't a breakup, it was a tactical expansion. It was a hub and spoke model that would make any MBA professor proud. LA was the intake valve. Terry handled the relationship with the Mexican cartels. He was the quiet one, the businessman. He lived in a mansion, but he stayed out of the clubs. He focused on logistics. He received the massive shipments, hundreds of kilos at a time, coming across the border. He organized the transport. Atlanta was the distribution hub and the marketing department. Meech took the product from LA and flooded the East Coast and the South. But Atlanta was more than just a market. It was the cultural capital of Black America. It was the home of So Def, LaFace Records, and the booming hip-hop scene. Meech realized that if he wanted to be untouchable, he needed to be visible. He needed to embed himself in the culture. So while Terry was in LA managing the supply chain in silence, Meech was in Atlanta throwing parties that cost $100,000 a night. He bought 15 luxury cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and painted them all the same color. He rented out entire hotel rooms for his crew. He created a cult of personality. He wasn't just a drug dealer, he was a celebrity. And this visibility gave him power. If you are friends with the biggest rappers, if you are buying bottles for the NBA players, the police hesitate. They wonder, is this guy legitimate? It was camouflaged through flamboyance. Now let's talk about the mechanics. How do you move thousands of kilograms of cocaine from LA to Atlanta, Detroit, St. Louis, and Louisville without ever getting caught? You don't use FedEx, you build your own fleet. BMF's transportation department was a masterpiece of engineering. They didn't just toss bags in the trunk, they bought high-end limousines and luxury SUVs. Then they hired specialized mechanics, guys who were geniuses with metal, to install complex electronic trap compartments. They weren't simple false bottoms. They were hydraulic traps that could only be opened if you performed a specific sequence of actions. Turn on the defroster, press the window switch up twice, and hit a button under the seat. If a cop pulled them over and searched the car, he would find nothing. The drugs were sealed inside the frame of the vehicle. They also separated the product from the money. One fleet of cars moved the drugs east, and completely different moved the cash west. They never crossed paths. If a drug car got seized, they lost the product but kept the money. If a money car got seized, they lost the cash but the drugs were safe. It was risk mitigation, and the drivers? They weren't gangsters. They were old men, grandfathers, guys who looked like they were driving to church or going on a cross-country RV trip. BMF famously used luxury RVs to move massive loads because police rarely pull over a retiree in a Winnebago. They had a rule: no speeding, no smoking weed in the car, obey all traffic laws. They moved in silence on the interstate, invisible in plain sight, carrying $5 million in cash or 50 kilos of coke, right next to a family on vacation. But the early 2000s, BMF was generating enough cash that they literally couldn't spend it fast enough. They had a problem: money laundering. You can't put $100 million in drug cash into a bank account. So Meech had a brilliant idea. He created BMF Entertainment. This wasn't a shell company on paper. It was a real record label. They signed artists. They promoted parties. They released DVDs. But the primary function of BMF Entertainment was to wash money. Think about the music industry. It's a cash-heavy, nebulous business. How much does it cost to produce a beat? How much does it cost to promote a party? Who knows? If BMF said they spent $2 million promoting a Young Jeezy concert, who could prove they didn't? They could take dirty drug money, use it to pay for legitimate expenses like billboards, music videos, and tour buses, and the revenue that came back was clean. This blurred the line between the underworld and the mainstream. BMF became a staple of hip-hop culture. Rappers shouted them out in songs. Young Jeezy famously was closely associated with BMF, though he denied criminal involvement. Fabulous, T.I., Jay-Z, everybody knew who Meech was. The BMF crew would show up in music videos. They were living the lifestyle that rappers were rhyming about. And the rain, that became their trademark. In the club, Meech wouldn't just buy drinks. He would have his crew stand on chairs and throw cash in the air for minutes at a time. It created a frenzy. It made them legends. It also made them targets. Because while the rappers loved the spectacle, the DEA was taking notes. You can't put up a billboard saying the world is BMF's and expect the feds to ignore you. The downfall of BMF began, like many empires, with internal conflict. The split between the brothers started to widen. Terry in LA was growing tired of Meech's antics. Terry was a businessman. He saw the billboards, the parties, the fights in clubs, and he saw a liability. He wanted to run a quiet, efficient drug cartel. Meech wanted to be a star. The wiretaps from the investigation, dubbed Operation Motor City Mafia, caught attention. Terry was recorded complaining about Meech's recklessness, saying things like, "He's bringing too much heat. He's out of control." The violence was escalating too. In 2003, there was a shootout at a club in Atlanta where 2 people were killed. P. Diddy's former bodyguard, Anthony Wolf Jones, was killed in a confrontation with BMF members. Meech was arrested but claimed self-defense and was acquitted. Even though Meech beat the charges, the incident put a spotlight on the organization. The Atlanta police, the DEA, and the IRS were now working together. They started connecting the dots. They realized that the guys shooting up the club were the same guys moving kilos in Detroit, and the same guys laundering money through the record label. The investigation was a massive multi-year puzzle. The DEA didn't just want the drivers, they wanted the heads. They needed to prove that Terry in LA and Meech in Atlanta were running the same conspiracy. They got their break through a combination of low-level snitches and high-level surveillance. They caught a BMF courier named Christopher Pig Triplett in Missouri with millions in cash. Triplett flipped. Then they caught another high-ranking member, Amari McCree. He flipped. The dominoes started to fall, but the smoking gun was the ledger. Agents seized the ledger from a BMF safe house that detailed the transactions. It wasn't written in code. It had names, dates, and amounts. It linked the cocaine shipments from the Mexican cartel directly to the Flannery brothers. In October 2005, the hammer dropped. The DEA raided BMF houses across the country simultaneously. They seized $21 million in cash, hundreds of kilos of cocaine, and millions of dollars in jewelry and cars. They arrested Meech in a luxury home in Texas. They arrested Terry in St. Louis. The indictment was sweeping. Continuing criminal enterprise. It carried a mandatory life sentence. The evidence was overwhelming. The wiretaps showed Terry coordinating shipments. The financial records showed the money laundering. The Flannery brothers, facing a mountain of evidence and the betrayal of their own crew members who testified against them, eventually led them to plead guilty. They were sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. So what is the legacy of the Black Mafia family? In one sense, it's a cautionary tale. It is the classic Icarus story of flying too close to the sun. If Meech had stayed in the shadows like Terry wanted, they might still be running the game today. Their hubris was their undoing. But in another sense, BMF achieved something no other American street gang ever did. They transcended crime to become a cultural icon. Look at the Starz television series BMF, produced by 50 Cent. It was a massive hit. Demetrius Flannery Jr., Meech's son known as Lil Meech, plays his own father in the show. Think about the layers of that. A major cable network is airing a sympathetic, glamorous biopic about a cocaine empire while the founders are sitting in prison and the founder's son is the star. That is the ultimate victory of the BMF brand. They commodified their own criminality. They proved that in America, if you make enough money and have enough style, the public will forgive the source of your wealth. They became Robin Hood figures in Detroit and Atlanta, handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving and paying for funerals, even as their product destroyed the very communities they claimed to love. BMF wasn't just a drug cartel, it was a dark reflection of the American dream. Ambitious, ruthless, and obsessed with fame at any cost. Take care of yourselves, and don't believe everything you see on a billboard.